This is the story of Rebekah, a woman who deeply loved her family but made choices that would divide it. She believed she was helping God's promise come true. But what began as faith slowly turned into control. Sometimes lying to help God with manipulation causes more pain than peace. The house was too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. The other kind, the kind that makes people whisper and tiptoe and pretend nothing's wrong when everything is. Inside a stone house surrounded by fig trees and vineyards, two brothers were growing up under the same roof, but not under the same love. One had his father's attention, the other had his mother's heart. And Rebekah noticed everything. She noticed how Isaac's eyes lit up when Esau brought home wild meat, the way he laughed louder when Esau was near. She noticed how Jacob would offer fresh bread or help fix the olive press. But Isaac barely nodded, and Rebekah's heart burned. She didn't say anything at first, just watched, prayed, waited. But deep down, something started curling up inside her like a knot. It didn't feel like jealousy, it felt like justice. After all, hadn't God told her the younger son would be the one to carry the promise? She hadn't told anyone else, not even Isaac, about the words God spoke to her when she was still pregnant. 2 nations are in your womb. The older will serve the younger. It had felt so clear back then, like lightning in her chest. But that was years ago. Now everything felt tangled. Favoritism, silence, tension. 2 sons living under one roof, but growing in opposite directions. Rebekah tried to stay quiet, to let it all work itself out. But each day that passed, Isaac clung tighter to Esau. And Jacob? He kept shrinking into the shadows. Sometimes at night, Rebekah would sit beside the oil lamp, her fingers twisting the corner of her robe. What if Isaac blesses the wrong son? She whispered once when the house was asleep. What if I wait too long and God's promise passes Jacob by? The wind outside rustled the trees. She didn't have an answer, but she had a growing feeling. Maybe, just maybe, God needed a little help. And if no one else would protect Jacob's future, she would. The next morning, Jacob was kneeling by the clay oven, stacking firewood with careful hands. The sun hadn't yet reached over the hill, and the house still slept in shadows. Rebekah watched him from the doorway, unnoticed. He was always up early, quietly useful, never asking for attention. It pained her how familiar he had become with being overlooked. She remembered how gentle his cries had been as a baby. How his tiny hand had once gripped her finger as if he already knew how to hold on. God had chosen him. She was sure of it. But no one else seemed to notice. Behind her, she heard Isaac's heavy footsteps and turned. He was leaning on his staff, rubbing his eyes, moving slower than usual. His sight had grown dim in recent months, and sometimes he called out to Esau, thinking it was Jacob. Rebekah had noticed but said nothing. She said nothing a lot these days, but her silence was no longer peaceful. It was loud inside her chest, pressing against her ribs like a heartbeat of urgency. Later that day, she found Esau polishing his arrows under a sycamore tree. He looked so much like his father when Isaac was younger. Strong shoulders, confident eyes. But when he spoke, Rebekah couldn't ignore how careless his words often were. "I'm heading out to the hills soon," Esau said. "Father's been asking for meat again, wants my best stew." Rebekah's fingers tensed around the linen she held. She knew what this meant. Isaac was preparing to bless Esau. The old traditions would unfold like clockwork. The meal, the prayer, the laying of hands. The blessing, once spoken, couldn't be undone. She walked away before Esau could say more, her heart racing. This was it. the moment she had feared. She returned to the kitchen and found Jacob there, as always, kneading bread, brow furrowed in focus. He didn't even look up when she entered. Rebekah stood still for a moment. She could feel the weight of time settling on her shoulders. She had trusted for so long that God would work things out, but the hours were slipping away like water through her fingers. Isaac would bless someone by sunset, and Rebekah knew in her bones it wouldn't be Jacob. She closed her eyes. If this was the only way, then she would be the one to act. Even if it meant stepping into a plan she wasn't sure how to finish, Rebekah paced the storeroom, her mind spinning. She had lived a quiet life, devoted, obedient, prayerful. But that morning, something shifted. A door had opened and she stood in the threshold between trust and control. She told herself it wasn't betrayal. She wasn't doing this out of pride or preference. She was protecting a promise, one she hadn't asked for, but one she was responsible for. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the herbs Jacob had dried last week: coriander, bay leaf, cumin. Esau's stews were always rich, wild, and savory. Jacob's were softer, deeper in flavor. Rebekah had tasted the difference her whole life. She had an idea. The blessing was tied to the meal. If Isaac couldn't see clearly anymore, and if the right meal came at the right moment, she stopped. This wasn't just cooking. This was a decision that would shape generations. For a moment, doubt crept in. What if this was wrong? What if God had a different plan? But then she remembered the way Isaac had smiled at Esau just the night before. The way Jacob had left the room quietly after no one asked him to stay. She took a deep breath. This wasn't about tricking anyone, she told herself. It was about realigning the path. The blessing had already been promised to Jacob. It was just heading in the wrong direction. Outside, the sun moved higher. There wasn't much time. Rebekah stepped into the courtyard where Jacob was rinsing dates and sorting grain. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. "Mother?" She didn't speak right away. She just looked at him, the younger son, the quiet one, the one no one saw coming. "I need you to trust me," she finally said. "We don't have long." Jacob tilted his head. "Why? What's going on?" She swallowed. "Your father is preparing to bless Esau today." His hands paused mid-motion. Rebekah continued before he could answer. "We will make the meal instead. You will go to him, and you will receive the blessing." Jacob's eyes widened. "But no questions," Rebekah said quickly, her voice both soft and firm. "This is not about tricking your father. This is about stepping into what was already promised. I've waited long enough." Jacob hesitated. Rebekah stepped closer and placed her hand on his arm. "I won't let your future slip away." And just like that, the first thread of the plan was pulled. Jacob stood frozen, his hands still dusted with flour, eyes searching his mother's face. "Do you really think this will work?" he asked, voice low. "Father knows Esau. He'll hear my voice. He'll know." Rebekah's mind was already racing ahead. She turned back toward the house, motioning for him to follow. "He's nearly blind, Jacob. He relies on smell, on taste, on touch. And you've been in the kitchen since you could walk. You know how to make stew better than anyone. If he eats what he loves and hears your words with the right heart, he'll bless you." Jacob hesitated. "But Esau's skin is rough. I'm not like him." Rebekah stopped in the hallway and turned to face him fully. "Then we'll use goat skins. From the ones we sheared last week. His arms, his neck. We'll make it close enough." The words felt strange as she said them. She wasn't used to planning details like this. She had always been the one to smooth things over, not stir things up. But something had changed in her. The longer she waited, the more urgent it had become. God had made a promise. She was just moving the pieces into place. In the kitchen, she lit the fire under the stew pot and began sorting the meat. Jacob stood in the doorway, still unsure. "What if it's wrong?" he whispered. "What if I end up cursed instead of blessed?" Rebekah didn't look up. She stirred the pot, adding herbs with a steady hand. "If there's blame, let it fall on me," she said quietly. "Just do what I say. Let me carry the risk." The words hung in the air. She hadn't planned to say them, but once spoken, they rang with certainty. If there was a cost to this plan, she would pay it. She had already spent too many years waiting, watching promises slip past while others claimed what didn't belong to them. She would not let Jacob be overlooked again. By midday, the stew was simmering, the goat skins were drying, and Jacob's hands were trembling as he held the rough fabric of Esau's robe. Rebekah placed the garment in his hands. "Put this on. When you go in, speak gently, like yourself, but with confidence. Your father is ready." Jacob slowly nodded, and Rebekah stepped back, her heart pounding, her mind filled with both hope and something heavier. She was helping God, wasn't she? Jacob stepped into the hallway, dressed in Esau's robe, with goat skins wrapped around his arms and neck. Rebekah stood beside the curtain that led to Isaac's room, listening to every footstep, every breath. This wasn't a game. It wasn't a simple trick. It was a line she couldn't uncross. She watched Jacob, her youngest, take a deep breath and push aside the curtain. Then he disappeared into the room. And Rebekah was left alone with silence. She pressed her hands together tightly, her ears strained for any hint of what was happening inside, Isaac's voice, Jacob's words, anything. A part of her wanted to storm in and make sure everything went perfectly. Another part of her wanted to run far away. This had to work. Time crawled. She tried to busy herself, checking the pot, folding a cloth, adjusting the oil lamp, but her hands were clumsy. Her thoughts kept returning to the last words Jacob had said. What if he curses me? And what had she promised? Let the blame fall on me. She meant it, but the weight of that promise was heavier than she expected. Inside the room, Isaac's voice finally broke through the wall. It was quiet and slow, like a man reaching through fog. "Come closer, that I may feel you, my son." Rebekah's stomach tightened. Jacob had always been honest, gentle, careful with his words. He wasn't a deceiver. He wasn't meant for lies, yet here he was, pretending to be someone he wasn't, for a blessing he was promised but never offered. Her thoughts spun in circles. Maybe if Isaac had listened, maybe if Jacob had been seen, maybe if Esau hadn't. She shook her head. It didn't matter now. The blessing was moments away. And once Isaac spoke those words, nothing could take them back. From where she stood in the hallway, Rebekah could hear Isaac's voice rise and fall like a fading melody. The words were old and sacred, passed down through generations, the kind of words that shaped futures and carried the weight of covenant. May God give you the dew of heaven, the richness of the earth. Nations will serve you. Rebekah's breath caught. It was done. The blessing had been spoken over Jacob. For a moment her heart swelled with relief. After all these years of watching Jacob shrink beneath his brother's shadow, he had finally been seen. finally received what she had always believed belonged to him. But then something strange happened. Instead of feeling triumph, she felt hollow. She leaned against the cool stone wall, pressing her fingers to her lips. Isaac's voice had sounded so gentle, so full of love. The words had been beautiful, almost too beautiful. But they hadn't been meant for Jacob, not in Isaac's mind. And that made it feel twisted. Rebekah had promised herself this was about truth, that she was restoring what had been ignored, but hearing those sacred words spoken over a son disguised in goat skins, her son, felt more like theft than justice. Still, she shook the thought from her mind. There wasn't time for doubt. Esau would be returning soon, and when he did, everything would change. She rushed to the edge of the courtyard and scanned the hills. The sun was sinking fast. Shadows stretched across the fig trees. Any moment now, Esau would come through the gate with fresh meat in hand, eager to please a father who had already given his final words to someone else. She turned back toward the house. Jacob stepped out from Isaac's room, pale and wide-eyed, the goat skins loosened at his wrists. He looked like someone who had walked into a dream, but wasn't sure if he was supposed to be there. Rebekah grabbed his shoulders and guided him quickly toward the outer rooms. "Go," she whispered. "Now. Esau will be here any minute." Jacob hesitated. But what if he finds out? "He will," Rebekah answered quietly. "But not before you're gone." Jacob disappeared around the corner, robe flapping behind him, and Rebekah stood alone again, waiting. The wind picked up, rustling the vines. In the distance, she heard the sound of footsteps, heavy ones. Esau was coming, and Rebekah's heart began to tremble. Esau's voice echoed through the courtyard before Rebekah even saw him. "Mother, tell the servants to get more firewood. I brought a ram this time." His tone was proud, upbeat, full of the confidence that had always made him seem larger than life. Rebekah didn't answer. She stayed behind the curtain, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, listening as Esau's heavy boots clapped against the stone floor and the smell of raw meat filled the air. He was humming now, probably imagining the moment he'd enter his father's tent and receive the blessing, his reward for a well-lived life and loyal obedience. Rebekah's chest tightened. She wanted to step forward to stop him. But what would she say? That she had sent Jacob in his place? That she had wrapped her son in goat skins and guided him into a holy moment wearing someone else's name? Number, she couldn't say anything. This part of the story would have to unfold on its own. From inside Isaac's chamber, she heard Esau call out, "Father, sit up. I've made your favorite meal. Now bless me." There was a pause. Then Isaac's voice, faint and broken. Who are you?" Rebekah closed her eyes. Everything fell silent for a heartbeat. Then the shouting began. Esau's voice turned from joy to disbelief, from disbelief to anger. "What do you mean someone else came? What do you mean he took my blessing?" Isaac's words were harder to hear now, weak and distant, but they carried something painful, a cracking, like a man realizing too late that the future had shifted beneath his feet. "No, your brother. He came in deceit, and I have already blessed him, and yes, he will be blessed." Rebekah's heart dropped. Esau roared, a sound like a wounded animal. "Bless me too, father. Isn't there anything left?" The response was barely a whisper. "I gave him everything." Rebekah pressed her hands to her face. This was the cost. This was what she had tried not to think about. In making sure Jacob received what was promised, she had shattered the heart of her other son. Esau had not only lost a blessing, he had lost trust. And Rebekah knew in that instant that things would never be the same. Esau didn't come out of Isaac's room for a long time. Rebekah waited in the hallway, hidden behind a woven curtain, unable to move. Her hands gripped the edge of the wall as if holding on could stop the storm she'd unleashed. When Esau finally stepped out, his face was red with fury, eyes wild, jaw clenched so tight his teeth barely moved when he spoke. He took everything. He wasn't talking to her. He was talking to himself over and over again. He took everything. Servants hurried out of his way as he stormed across the courtyard and kicked over a clay jar, shattering it against the wall. Rebekah flinched. She had never seen him like this. Esau was impulsive, yes, but not dangerous, not like this. Then came the words that chilled her to the bone. When father dies, I'll kill him. It was barely above a whisper, but she heard it. Clear, sharp, final. She didn't wait. Within moments, she was in Jacob's room, pulling down the travel cloths from the shelves, stuffing them into his satchel with trembling fingers. "Pack now," she said. "You have to go." Jacob blinked, still stunned from what had happened earlier. "Go where?" "To your uncle Laban's, in Haran." "But that's—" "I know how far it is," she snapped, then softened. "I'll send word when it's safe. You just have to go now, tonight." He didn't argue. He saw her face, tight with panic, and knew this wasn't like before. This wasn't just a clever plan. This was survival. Outside, Esau was still pacing, still muttering. Isaac's room had fallen silent. Rebekah wrapped bread in cloth and handed it to Jacob, brushing his hair away from his forehead like she had when he was a child. "I don't know how long you'll be gone," she whispered. "But this isn't goodbye. It's just for now." He looked at her, eyes full of something between sorrow and fear. "Do you think he'll really kill me?" She didn't answer. Instead, she opened the back gate, pushed it just wide enough for him to slip out, and kissed his cheek. "Go." And just like that, the son she had fought so hard to lift up was gone. And the home she had tried to protect was beginning to fall apart. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. It was heavier now, empty, like a song that had lost its final note. Jacob was gone. Esau had stopped shouting, but he hadn't spoken to her since. He stayed in the hills most days, returning only to sleep, barely making eye contact with anyone. The laughter he used to bring, the noise that once filled the courtyard, had vanished. And Isaac, he said little at all. He spent more and more time in his room, sitting beside the fire, eyes cloudy, voice soft. Rebekah brought him meals, but he barely touched them. She tried to talk, to sit beside him the way she used to, but there was distance now, invisible and thick, and she didn't know how to cross it. She walked the halls like a shadow. Every corner of the house reminded her of Jacob, his quiet steps, his careful hands, his patient spirit. She missed him more than she could say. And yet, she was the reason he had to leave. The goat skins, the stew, the robe, they had all seemed so clever in the moment, so necessary. But now they felt like pieces of a broken picture. At night, she sat alone under the fig tree, the stars blinking silently above her. She had once heard God speak so clearly, "The older will serve the younger." That voice had been sure, strong, unmistakable. But now, in the silence, she couldn't tell if she'd acted out of faith or fear. Had she protected a promise, or had she rushed it? Her heart said both, and her heart was heavy. Wind moved through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, Esau's bowstring snapped. She closed her eyes. She had loved deeply. She had tried to protect what mattered, but in trying to help God, she had broken something that love alone could not fix. Would you like to continue with part 10? The seasons changed, but the silence in the house did not. Spring came, then summer. The vines bloomed, the fig trees filled out, and the hills turned green again. But inside Rebekah's home, everything still felt gray. Jacob had not returned. There had been no letters, no messengers, no word at all from Laban's land. Rebekah tried to believe he was safe, that he was working, growing, building a life. But she longed to hear his voice, just once. She kept busy, checking the ovens, instructing the workers, grinding grain, but even her footsteps felt tired now. Each day ended the same way. Her standing at the edge of the courtyard, looking toward the eastern hills, hoping to see someone familiar walking toward her. But no one came. Esau still lived in the house, but his heart had wandered far. He married 2 local women without asking her advice, and their presence, loud, demanding, dismissive, only deepened the rift between them. Rebekah tried to smile when they passed in the hall, but inside, her spirit winced. These weren't the daughters she had prayed for. These weren't the women she had imagined building a future with. Once, she had dreamed of both sons sitting at the same table. She had imagined blessings shared, laughter echoing, grandchildren running through the vines. She had wanted peace. But her plan hadn't led to peace. It had led to distance. Isaac aged quickly in those years. His voice became softer, and he often drifted into memories, speaking of wells and journeys, his father Abraham, the promise of the stars. Rebekah stayed near him, quietly folding cloth, pressing warm cups into his hands, but he never spoke of the blessing again, and Rebekah never asked. Each night she whispered prayers into her pillow, prayers for Jacob's safety, for Esau's heart, for her husband's peace. But most of all, for time. Time to heal what had been broken. Time to see Jacob's face again. Time to feel whole. Years passed, like sand slipping through a sieve, grain by grain, soft and slow. Rebekah's hair turned silver. Her hands became thinner, her steps more careful. But her eyes still watched the road every morning, just in case Jacob returned. She never stopped hoping. Sometimes, when the house was quiet, she would sit by the olive press and remember the early days, before twins, before blessings, before the ache. Back when she and Isaac had spoken freely and laughed easily. Back when all of this still felt like a promise instead of a burden. One day, as she sat beneath the fig tree with her hands in her lap, she overheard Esau speaking to one of the servants. "I'm thinking of moving farther north," he said. "There's more space for the herds, maybe some peace too." The word struck her like a soft blow. He was still her son. And though the closeness they once had never returned, he had not left completely. He had stayed nearby, though not truly with her. And now, it seemed, even that season was ending. She whispered a prayer she didn't quite know how to finish. She had tried so hard to hold things together, to guide her family into God's promise, but somewhere along the way, she had tightened her grip too much. What she had meant for good had spun into grief. And yet, even in the silence, she could feel it. God had not abandoned her. Jacob hadn't written, but stories had trickled in. A cousin passing through mentioned a man with many flocks and strange dreams. Another traveler said he'd seen a man working for Laban, growing strong, leading servants. It was only a whisper of news, but it was enough. Jacob was alive. Rebekah pressed her hand to her heart. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again, but God had not lost him. And slowly, like the first light after a long night, she began to believe something she hadn't dared to in years. Maybe God's promise hadn't been broken after all. The wind had changed. Rebekah noticed it first in the trees, how the branches moved slower, heavier, as if they too were waiting for something. She was older now. Her hands were worn, her legs stiff, and her voice softer than it once was. But her eyes remained sharp. She still looked out toward the road every morning. And one day, she saw movement. A line of dust, a group of people, flocks, trailing behind. Her breath caught in her throat. Could it be? The servants gathered quickly, whispering, pointing. Word traveled faster than feet. Jacob had returned. He was older, his shoulders broader, his eyes more serious, but it was him. She hurried as fast as her legs would carry her, trembling with every step, and then he was there, standing in front of her like a dream. "Mother," he said. She didn't speak. She only reached for his face, touching his cheek like she used to when he was a boy. Tears slipped down her skin before she could stop them. He held her, arms strong around her frail shoulders, and for a moment the years between them disappeared. But not all wounds were gone. Behind him, Jacob's family gathered, wives, children, flocks. He had built a life without her, and she had lived a lifetime without him. They sat under the fig tree that evening, as the sun slipped below the hills. Rebekah listened as Jacob spoke of dreams and wrestlings, of long nights and longer journeys. He didn't mention Esau, neither did she. But in her heart, she wondered, had Esau healed? Had he forgiven? Would they ever sit together as brothers again? She didn't know. But for the first time in years, she felt peace. Not because her plan had worked, but because somehow God's plan had endured, despite her fears, despite her mistakes. She looked at Jacob seated beside his sons, smiling quietly at the youngest, and she whispered mostly to herself, "God's promise didn't need my help, just my trust." The wind stirred the fig leaves above her. And for the first time in a long time, Rebekah rested. The house was quiet again, but this time the quiet felt kind. Rebekah no longer feared the silence. She welcomed it. It gave her time to think, to remember, to breathe. She spent her morning sitting beneath the vine-covered trellis, letting the sun warm her skin. Sometimes she watched Jacob's children chasing each other through the garden, their laughter rising like music into the sky. Sometimes she just listened to the wind. So much had changed. Isaac was old now, nearly blind. His voice faded like a whisper in the evenings, but he still asked for Rebekah's hand when they walked through the courtyard. She held it gladly. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't have to. Too much had been said, and some things had healed only with time. Esau had not returned. But Rebekah had heard that he too was growing older, that he had built a strong household in the hills, away from them, that he had prospered despite the pain. She prayed for him every night. She always had. Jacob was busy most days, managing flocks, making plans, teaching his sons the ways of their people. He often checked on her, bringing fresh bread or figs without saying much, but when he smiled at her, there was no more tension, no more fear, just love, and that was enough. Rebekah thought often about the moment everything had changed: the stew, the disguise, the trembling voice of her son pretending to be someone else. She had wanted to protect the promise. But now, after all this time, she realized something simple and hard. God didn't need protecting. His promises don't break. They bend, they stretch, they outlast even our biggest mistakes, and still, they come true. Her story hadn't gone the way she imagined, but God's story still held. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes as the fig leaves fluttered above her like soft wings. Whatever came next, she was ready to trust him with it. The news came just before sunset. A servant came running up the hill, out of breath, eyes wide. "He's coming!" he shouted. "Esau is coming, with hundreds of men." The courtyard erupted in whispers and hurried feet. Jacob's wives gathered the children. Shepherds dropped what they were doing. Jacob stood still, his face pale, heart pounding. He looked to Rebekah. He didn't say a word, but she saw the question in his eyes. "Will he kill me?" Rebekah stood slowly from her seat beneath the vine trellis. Her hands trembled slightly, but not with fear, with weight, with the gravity of a moment long awaited. She looked out over the land as the dust rose in the distance, Esau's caravan approaching like a cloud of memory and judgment. It had been years, a lifetime. 2 brothers, torn apart by a blessing, 2 sons, separated by her choice. And now they were about to stand face to face. Jacob began walking down the hill to meet him, step by step, past his family, past the flocks, alone, bowing low again and again as he drew near. Rebekah held her breath. Then, something no one expected. Esau ran. Not with anger, with tears. He rushed to Jacob and threw his arms around him, sobbing into his brother's shoulder. Not a warrior, not a rival, a brother. Rebekah gasped. Her hands flew to her mouth. She staggered back a step and laughed, half in joy, half in relief. They embraced for a long time. No revenge, no curses, just weeping, just grace. The sound of it rose through the air like music that reached all the way back to her heart. God had done it. Not through her plan, not through disguise or strategy, through mercy, through time, through something she never could have arranged on her own. Rebekah sank slowly onto the bench behind her, tears streaming down her cheeks. For the first time in decades, both her sons were alive, safe, together. Not everything had been fixed, but healing had begun. And somehow, in the midst of all she had broken, God had built something beautiful. The sun slipped below the horizon, the fig trees rustled softly, and Rebekah smiled, whispering to the sky, "Your promise never needed my help, just my surrender."